Hi, this is Zach with Warner Wound, and today I'll be taking a look at the Nomos Minimatik watches. The Minimatik was first announced at Baselworld 2015 alongside the announcement of a new caliber for the brand, the DUW 3001. This is a really big announcement for the brand because, I mean, anytime a new caliber comes out, it's obviously a really big announcement. It was entirely made in Germany, used their swing system, which is their entirely German-made escapement system. So it was just a big announcement for the brand, and it's also a very thin movement at 3.2 millimeters thick. So by using that movement versus their older movements, it allows them to make a line of automatic watches that are thin, very competitively thin, I should say. Not ultra thin watches, but definitely thinner than your average automatic watches, which works very well with the brand given their svelte styling and generally small cases. This watch in particular kind of caught our eye and it's an interesting watch because after coming out, I think it kind of went under the radar a little bit. So they've continued to push the Metro. They came out with a whole line of watches that use that new movement, which have the badge on it, Neomatic. This also has Neomatic on it. So most of their old line now is available with the super thin automatic movement. And the Minimatik itself has just maintained in their line. They've increased the amount of colors from 1 to 3. But we hadn't had a chance to really look at it, nor had seen in person. But it's a very interesting watch that kind of follows in the footsteps of the Metro. So the Metro, when that came out, had a very modern design, very contemporary, and it's sort of a different direction for the brand, and certainly not in the industry standard kind of aesthetic. So it doesn't really look like anything else out there. And the Minimatik kind of followed in these footsteps. So it's clean, it's modern, it's a little bit playful, it's a little bit fun, has some interesting colors to it, and just creates an interesting aesthetic that I think is really thoroughly Nomos. As with all the Nomos, it's entirely German-made and has a retail price point that, while an investment for sure, is definitely unique within the market and relatively inexpensive. Obviously, that is for a German-made luxury watch. So the silver model here is $3,680. Then you have the Nachtblau, which is $3,800. And the Champagner, which is also $3,800. So let's take a closer look. The case of the Minimatik stays true to Nomos's philosophy for making smaller watches. I don't know if that's actually a philosophy of theirs or it's just the way they do things, but it's definitely something that has set them apart from modern brands. This watch has a diameter of 35.5 millimeters, a lug-to-lug of 42.3, and a thickness of only 9 millimeters, and that is to the top of this domed sapphire crystal. So it is a very thin watch thanks to that new extra thin automatic movement. So 35.5 millimeters, obviously that is smaller than your average modern watch, your average men's watch, but I think there's a lot of tricks here to make it actually wear very well, have a lot of presence on the wrist, and frankly be sized appropriately. I think honestly with Nomos, if you're looking for big gaudy watches, they're just not a brand you go to. So this is just very much them staying true. But the design of this case is actually really beautiful, and I've seen a lot of Nomoses, and this one actually really stands out to me, though it's has some subtle details. So from the top, it's actually a fairly classic design. You have a big dial, thin bezel, short contouring lugs. One thing that people often complain about with Nomoses is that the lugs are very long. That's not something I personally find issue with. I actually really like a little bit of a longer lug because it gives a little bit extra gap between the strap and the case, which to me defines the kind of case geometry, lets the dial shine. But this watch kind of responds to that and is a little bit shorter. So here you can obviously see that the strap itself is closer to the case, so there's no gap there. But yeah, it's a simple and elegant design. The way the curves all flow into each other just works and has a kind of a clean look. It's a little bit vintage, but I think the execution overall has a very modern feel. When you look at it from the side, the kind of elegance of the case becomes even more apparent. So once again, a very classic kind of profile, but you have this really nice detail of how the bezel sits down into the mid case a little bit. So there's a little bit of notch right here that runs along. It's a very elegant detail that I really like, and I think just kind of gives the watch this very smooth feeling. Also on the side, and you can't quite see this from here, the whole case tapers up and out. So the side is not flat, it angles up. So you're looking from this angle, you can see how it flares up towards the dial. So it's smaller on the case back. This once again just kind of adds to an overall look and feel of the watch having kind of a flow to it. And then the sides themselves are ever so subtly rounded. And that's a really beautiful detail that makes it reflect light in an interesting way, gives it this sort of fluid feeling to it. And it all runs into this really nice domed sapphire crystal. It's not too dramatic, but the crystal itself does kind of finish off that flow feeling. And just overall, I think a really beautifully detailed case that I think is actually very modern when you kind of look at it and look at these details. So size speaks to classic watches, but the actual construction and design is very modern. Looking at the case back of the watch, you have a very large display that shows off the new DUW 3001 caliber. There's a couple interesting things going on here. So actually, it's a small watch, so obviously that window looks really big, but the movement itself, while thin, is actually a little bit wider than some other movements. So it's actually a little bit wider than a 2824, though at 3.2 millimeters thick, it's 1.4 millimeters thinner than that. So it just has a very it has a big look in comparison to the watch itself. And I happen to like that because there's a lot to look at. So the movement is really interesting, and we will put a video in the article itself that has the engineer at Nomos talking about what they did. But the idea with this movement was obviously they wanted to make it very thin, but they also wanted to make it kind of very mass producible. That's part of how Nomos works to kind of keep their prices where they are, produce a large amount of watches in a year. So the entire gear train and most of the mechanics actually sit between the base plate and this large glass chute 3/4 plate that's above here. There's only a millimeter of gap between them, and all the pieces fit within there. To get the kind of tolerances they need, they actually use some interesting new materials, and they just created this very elegant, very actually simple looking in a sense, ultra thin automatic. So it has 27 joules. It's hacking, hand winding, has a frequency of 21,600 beats per hour, a 42-hour power reserve. And there's one really interesting feature of it that we won't be able to show you. I tried to get this to work, but I couldn't do it. When the watch is fully wound, the rotor will actually lock in place, thus stopping any more energy from being put into the system. I believe that's something that no other movement does. Looking at the design and architecture of it, like I said, it has a very simple look to it. So there's not a lot of bridges and plates. There's just this one big plate on top of a base plate. That base plate has perlage going all the way around. And underneath the balance, you'll actually see some finer perlage. Then you have the glass chute 3/4 plate, which is actually, I think, bigger than 3/4 in this instant. That has glass chute ribbing, as they call it, but you'll probably also refer to it as Côte de Genève, running along the whole thing. Beveled edges, blued screws. Simple decoration, but it works. It's elegant. This full bridge balance here, that's new for the brand. Their other movements don't have that. I believe, I've read that those are better for shock absorption. I believe there's some debate on that, but it gives the watch a very kind of finished look to it. So you have a circle plate with the finish with a full bridge sitting on top of a base plate, which creates a sort of gutter around the side. And then the rotor here, the skeletonized rotor, also finished with glass chute ribbing, is very, very thin with most of the mass of weight actually riding around in that sort of gutter. And that's how they keep it at 3.2 millimeters thick. And just for reference, so you know how that sits within other movements, like I said, the 2024 is 4.6 millimeters thick. A Miyota 9015 is 3.9 millimeters thick. The 2892, which is ETA's sort of thinner movement, is 3.6 millimeters thick, which is also the thickness of the Soprod M100. The only movement that's really thinner than this that you'll find in relatively competitive price point would be the Vaucher VMF 5401, which is 2.6 millimeters thick, which has a micro rotor, and you'll find that in watches like the Slim Dare Maze, which is in the 5 to 7K range. So That's quite a bit more expensive than this, but just so you can know the kind of comparison of where this sits. So it's a very unique movement and obviously a big achievement for the brand. Some of their watches that they put this in are actually even quite a bit thinner than the Minimatic itself. The dial of the Minimatic, I think, really balances a quirky kind of playfulness that Nomos has become known for with a kind of just a restraint balance so that it is actually a very versatile watch, a watch that kind of can ride between casual and formal, and just actually just a very unique watch despite having, a minimal amount of markers. So you'll find across the three colors basically the exact same design. We'll go through each three, obviously the colors shift around. So you have a main hour index here on what I'll call the silver dial. They don't actually have a name for this dial, but it is just kind of a plated silver. So the main hour index here has Arabic numerals at the even hours, except for 6 where you have a subdial, and dots for the odd hours. That's in a very kind of nice looking charcoal gray. It's not black, it's a little bit softer than that, and that comes across as just a more subtle kind of contrast. Around that, you have a minute index, which is where actually this watch gets particularly playful. So at 5-minute intervals are these little golden-looking pearls, if you will, and that's consistent across all 3 models. It's a really interesting little detail. It's metallic. It's rounded, and when you look at it with your naked eye, it almost looks like it comes up out of the dial. But if you look at it with a loupe, you'll see that it's actually milled into the dial a little bit. So there are little indentations. It's a subtle but kind of beautiful effect that, once again, just kind of a cool detail. There's no real, I can't really think of a logic of you doing exactly that, but I really like that it's there. The individual minutes then on the silver dial are in a cyan blue. Cyan is like a really bright, kind of almost a shocking blue color. So it's not something you'd expect to find here. At a glance, though, it comes across dark and reads almost almost as black. And then only when you focus in on it do you see that it's blue, because the dots themselves are so fine. It's a very interesting effect, and once again kind of speaks to this quirkiness. But that for a palette, a silver dial with a gray hours and then cyan and then gold. I mean, that's really, I can't think of another brand that would play with colors like that and yet still achieve something that's quite so reserved and elegant. At 6 here, you also have a bright orange dot that's consistent across all the watches. I believe that might even be on all their Neomatic watches, but I'll have to double check on that. But it's, once again, why is there fluorescent orange there? I'm not sure, but somehow that works. The hour and minute hand have a nice design. Very simple and elegant. They work well, but they're not like common hands. So they're needles they're very thin and they get ever so thinner towards the tip. They have an interesting little detail as they reach the center of the dial where they kind of round out. So there's a smooth transition from the needle into the center of the dial. And then on the silver model, the hour and minutes are this dark red. I love that they did that color. It's really, once again, unexpected. I think of color hands as being more of a sporty thing, more of a casual thing. And it definitely does give the watch an air of more casual, like if they'd gone with a stainless steel hand there. I definitely think this watch would have felt more formal, but it doesn't feel inappropriately casual either. Looking at the subdial now, very large subdial. It has a nice kind of positioning on the dial overall, sits really nicely between the edge of the dial and the center. It's big. I happen to really like sub-second, so that's the kind of thing I find very appealing. For the markers in there, it just has gray lines at intervals of 5 seconds, and then it has concentric circular graining and a slightly beveled edge which catches the light a little bit differently than the dial itself. So that just creates some nice texture, kind of breaks up the surface, and just has like a nicely finished feel. The hand there is then a simple stick hand. On the silver dial, also in dark red. Now looking at the Nachtblau model, Nomos released a handful of these dark blue Nachtblau watches several months ago, and definitely got a lot of attention for it. Though there's a million blue watches out there now, they just do things a little bit differently. And once again, I think it's the overall palette, not just the blue, that makes the Nachtblau stand out as far as blue watches goes. So here, instead of a gray hour index, it's this pale beigey kind of washed out gold color. It's just a beautiful color that on its own might be kind of plain, but when you put it with blue, it works so well and it kind of takes on these other properties. Like, the fact that it feels sort of gold rather than drab or beige, I think is because of how it complements the blue. The minute index then, still the same little gold markers, and then also the cyan once again. And you can see how different the cyan feels on the dark blue dial rather than on the silver dial. On the silver dial, it almost read as dark. Here, it pops out. It's bright. It's like a little highlight running around. It's a beautiful look. I really like it. It's still actually quite legible. The subdial then really goes for kind of a wow factor. So on the blue, they went with cyan once again, but for the 5-second intervals. And then for the hand there, they went with a fluorescent orange. And I mean a really fluorescent orange that from all angles is bright. It's a piercing color. It's quite the shock, and I think Nachtblau, this kind of nighttime watch, and it feels like a highlight, like a streak of lights, like a car driving down a dark street, something like that. I think it's very cool. I will say, though, that it perhaps is a bit distracting on this watch. The other hands, the hour and minute hand, are polished steel, and if anything, they kind of recede into the dial. At times, they're a little bit hard to see. They can, because of the reflections, the polished surface can reflect dark back at you, so they'll be a little bit lost against the surface. Plus, there's some glare on the crystal, which kind of plays with that. So they're just very subtle. They're low key, and then you have this this just bright subdial here. It's on one hand, I really like it because it's fun. On the other hand, it does kind of take away from the more important functions. So you can kind of take that as you will, see if you go for personality or if you want the kind of the more restrained look overall. Either way, you can't argue that it is unique. Lastly, you have the Champagner model. Overall, I'd say this with almost all of Nomos' watches is that they're very unisex. And that's certainly true for the Minimatik. I think all the watches could be worn by both genders, though the Champagner definitely has a more feminine feel. In this instance, also partially coming from the strap, but the dial overall is just a lighter, it's a little softer, a little warmer. It just makes it a touch more feminine, but it's still no less interesting. So the dial surface itself, it's once again kind of back to galvanized plating look, sort of like the silver, but it's warmer, and it has this kind of washed out golden look, sort of warm silver. It's a very interesting color, and I think champagne is definitely a correct thing to refer to it, because it's a strange color, and you can't quite put your finger on it. Sometimes it looks dark, sometimes it looks bright, sometimes it looks steely, sometimes it looks warm and yellow. It's very interesting. The hour index on here, like the silver, is dark gray. It's that kind of soft color. It's even softer against the champagne, but it stands out still. It looks nice. Then you have the gold markers. And then for the minute markers here, you have fluorescent orange. Really odd choice, and it has a very strange optical effect. So whereas in the other watches, those minutes really stood out, here they're almost invisible at times. In fact, there's almost a trick, an optical trick that happens when you look at the gray hours, you almost don't see the orange at all. And then you look at the orange and you see it. It pops out. This puts a lot of visual emphasis on the hours, so it really kind of makes this watch, this specific model, about that. And then the orange just kind of adds warmth, kind of adds this odd kind of outer glow to the dial, which might go towards that kind of rosier feeling I talked about before. The hands now, hour and minute hands, are polished steel, sticking with the kind of conservative look. And then for the subdial, you have gray for the intervals of 5 seconds, and then once again that bright orange hand. Similar sort of situation where the bright orange does kind of distract from everything else, but it highlights the orange around it. So here it makes a little bit more sense. It's not it's not like a total diversion. It kind of plays off of other things that are going on, but it's still a strange watch. I think had that been stainless steel, had they gone with a more traditional color around, this watch would have actually felt like a very formal version of it. But that's like not quite Nomos' style, so they had to add a little bit of color, make it a little bit more fun. Certainly a unique watch, and I can definitely see this being appealing, very appealing to the right person. On the wrist, the Minimatik wears exceptionally well. I'm a self-professed kind of small watch lover, so this is definitely in my wheelhouse, but I think This is a watch that will appeal to people who maybe wanted to test the waters of smaller watches, and or anybody who's worn, frankly, a vintage watch, because 35.5 is really not that odd for a watch from, the 50s or 60s. It's just, by today's standards, a little bit small. But what they did with the proportions of the case really brings that dial out. So there's a lot of dial here, and any watch that's all dial feels bigger than, its actual diameter. So here, I think you have a lot of presence. I mean, that dial, you don't really want it any larger. Then the case itself just frames it very elegantly. And the case is so svelte and so sleek. I mean, this is a watch you really forget you're wearing. It's very light also because it's so small, but it slips under your shirt sleeve without any notice because it's very, it's very thin, but it's also very smooth. So, that your shirt just glides over that domed crystal there. And then all the curves are just so elegant. They just flow so beautifully. It's just on the wrist. I mean, it really has this sort of look of being sort of a little metal jewel. But then the dial itself, these kind of playful notes really come out, but it's also formal in the right ways. If anything, it's what I love about this watch is that it's just such a great everyday watch for, all non-aggressive, non-sport, non-water activities. Like, I would have absolutely no qualms wearing this to a meeting, wearing this to a formal restaurant, or anything like that. I think you can really dress it up or dress it down. At the same time, it's like I said, those little hints of color make it fun. They make it casual. They give it personality that I think typically dress watches really don't have. I mean, dress casual watches, or frankly, really any watch doesn't really have right now, and that makes it much more modern feeling. So yeah, I mean, it really, it's a funny watch because in some ways it kind of reveals itself to you as you wear it as having so much personality. Now, of the various colors, the silver one really kind of called out to me. And that is after wearing them all considerably. Something about the balance of colors, the use of the dark red, it just kind of worked that, for me, this went the most with my kind of style. But we will show you the other ones, which are also quite beautiful. Looking at the Champagner model, this is really a unique, almost exotic looking watch. The rosy kind of champagne color and dark gray actually recede back. So in some ways there's less contrast, it's less loud than the silver model, but then you have this orange highlight of a second hand which jumps way forward and way out into your eyes. And as you pick up the orange glint around, that has this strange effect. I mean, it's really hard to put your eyes on. Like I said before, it's an optical effect. It's almost an illusion effect where it kind of comes and goes. It creates a very interesting watch. Like I said, this one's just a little bit more feminine, especially on this strap, which is kind of a flesh tone strap, which is a little, to me, just a little too close to my own skin tone. That makes me, I just don't like that look. So the overall feeling a little too warm, a little too rosy for me. But it's just a fascinating watch. And I wonder if the strap was different, if it was on a gray strap or a suede strap, if I'd really actually have a different feeling about the watch itself overall. Lastly, looking at the Nachtblau on the wrist, equally gorgeous and very interesting watch. This obviously is dark, whereas the other two are light, but I don't think it's, it's not dark and serious looking as sometimes like a black dial versus a white dial can be. There still has that interesting softness. You still have the playful kind of aspects of the color coming through. I definitely think for a lot of people it would be a toss-up between this and the silver dial, especially with blue being kind of trendy right now. A lot of blue dials around. It's a nice alternative to black. For me, the silver one, like I said, just felt a little bit more versatile, especially since it didn't have a real shock of color like the orange here. So in some ways, it's a little bit more restrained, though in other ways, it's a little more casual, whereas this one feels formal and then has this shock of being very casual in the lower half. But, I think as far as how it goes with clothing and everything, this is really a stunning model. The Minimatik comes on a shell cordovan strap, except for the Champagner model. If you're familiar with other Nomos watches, such as the Club and the Orion, those also come on shell cordovan straps. And it's actually one of the things that people, and myself included, really like about Nomos brand is that they make these really elegant, or rather their watches come on these really elegant Horween shell cordovan straps. They're very simple, but they're just made out of this beautiful material. For the Minimatic, as well as I believe perhaps for some other watches, particularly their solid gold models, they went with a kind of a higher end version of that strap. So it has a kind of a more built out look, which I'll go over now. So first thing you need to know about this is that it actually has 17 millimeter lugs. That is obviously peculiar. It's obviously a bit annoying. You probably don't have a 17 millimeter strap in your collection. And it does kind of force you to buy your straps from Nomos. They do sell a replacement for this strap. It's $140, so not inexpensive, and it only comes in black unless you get the calfskin version, which we'll show you in a minute. So it is a little bit limiting. Hopefully they'll expand on that in the future. I'd love to see color 8. I'd love to see blue and brown. But it's certainly a very well-made and substantial strap. So this is done in what's called rem bordé style. I might have butchered that pronunciation. But so what that means is that it actually has a folded edge here, which might be hard to see on camera, but rather than a painted edge, the leather is thinned and wrapped around and then stitched. So you have this kind of all leather top. It's definitely a more complicated method of construction than just cutting and painting the edges. And then the strap itself has a top layer, a layer of padding, so it's actually quite rigid, and then a back layer as well. And the back layer is also shell cordovan. So you have like a kind of a sandwich of cordovan here. On one hand, that gives it this very built-out feel to it. It feels very, substantial. On the other hand, it does kind of stop you from feeling kind of the natural suppleness of shell cordovan. And I don't know if this will break in the same way shell cordovan usually breaks in, which in my opinion is actually one of the nicest things about shell cordovan. So only time would tell. Regardless, it's obviously a very well-made and attractive strap that does work with the styling of the watch. The watch, it also comes with a new type of clasp for Nomos. They call this their winged clasp. It's a nice design. It's definitely, I love seeing brands just go the extra mile and design their own clasps. Obviously, a watch that's at this price point, you're going to, frankly, I think you should expect to find that level of customization. What's cool about this is, first of all, the design. It just kind of fits with the kind of Nomos modern, German sort of Bauhaus aesthetic they have going on. And it acts as both a buckle and a keeper because the strap goes up, through, and under. So then you only have one keeper on the strap itself, something I'm a big fan of because sometimes sewn-in keepers can break and then you're kind of, left in an awkward situation. They also sell these replacement of these, and they're actually fairly inexpensive. They're under $30. On the Champagner, you have a different style of the same strap that isn't made out of shell cordovan. Rather, it's made out of veg-tanned cowhide. Obviously, the color makes the big difference, but also has a slightly different feel to it. You could obviously get this strap and put it on the other watch, or get the cordovan strap and put it on this watch, but you'd be doing that kind of after the fact. The leather here, I'm a fan of the kind of concept of natural leather. It will patina differently. But when it's fresh and it's new, it's very pink looking, which, as I'll comment on, has kind of a strange feel, especially if your skin tone sort of is close to it as mine is, so it kind of matches a little bit too much. Nevertheless, it has a really high quality feel to it, and kudos to them for actually trying something different like this. To wrap up, the Minimatik is a watch that reveals itself slowly. At first glance, it might seem like a simple modern design, friendly, attractive, but perhaps superficial. Through wearing it, especially in its various palettes, you get the sense that it's much more. Its simplicity is actually modesty and quiet sophistication, seen in the subtle detailing and exacting proportions. The aesthetic is approachable and inviting, but mature and restrained. It balances a playfulness found in surprising color choices with understated ingredients. Ultimately, it's exactly what a modern, versatile, everyday watch should be. It has a fun personality needed to reflect your own style, but the poise required for more serious encounters. At $3,680 for the Silver Classic model and $3,800 for the Nachtblau and Champagner models, the Minimatik is obviously an investment, but still relatively reasonable for a German-made luxury timepiece with an in-house movement. That doesn't make the price easier to stomach, but Nomos is uniquely positioned in the market. Honestly, its stiffest competition is from other Nomos watches, as no other brand really has comparable aesthetics. While I don't understand the premium for the latter two models, $3,680 for the silver, considering the new very thin automatic movement and overall finishing and style, seems fair in the context of the market, even if I wish it cost less. Having worn the watches for a little while, I think it's a strong candidate for a two-watch collection. You have the Minimatik and then some well-rounded sports watch or chronograph, depending on your lifestyle. In that context, paying a little more makes a lot more sense. Thank you for watching. Please read the full review on warnerwound.com and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.